You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We're still in 1 Samuel. We just wrapped up chapter 4, and I think we're getting ready to go into 5.
We are getting ready to explore what happens whenever God's ark gets disrespected among the Israelites.
Yeah, there's a whole lot to this story that, I mean, there's just a lot of layers and a lot of humor, and I'm excited to get into this one. So
it's a side of God I don't think you see often.
Well, yeah, I mean, how often do you read this story? Because usually we kind of it's one of those we just read past, and we read past these details. We don't look at the fact that what happens is actually pretty humorous. So
it is, and like you said, there's so many layers because I put together my set of layers, and you said you've got a layer that you want to add, and so I think that we're going to actually be here maybe for a couple of weeks with the ark and traveling with the Philistines.
Really?
Yeah.
Like on a few weeks?
Well, a couple of weeks, with this chapter and the next chapter, because it all covers same thing.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Maybe 3. I don't know. We'll see.
That's a long time, but that's more time than I expected to be on this story, but there's a lot to it.
There's always more time than we expect on a story.
Fair enough.
So,
except when there's not.
Yeah. Well, and then...
I'm sorry.
Well, no, but there are some stories it's kind of like, okay, there's really no further explanation. The text is pretty clear. There's not a lot to bring into it. There aren't a lot of those stories. Most of the time, the Bible is multi-layered, but occasionally you have that one that's just like, he walked up to Jericho. I mean, we can't really get anything else besides that. So
yeah. So all right. Well, let's go ahead and. So last we left, Eli was
dead.
He was dead. His daughter-in-law was giving birth to his grandson, and the ark had been taken. So she says the glory is left.
The glory is departed, or
the glory
it's
is
been
exiled.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think exile really is the best translation there, especially given the Egyptian connections we've had throughout this book. And even within the story, because remember, the Philistines, when they got ready to go into battle, they recounted the events of the Exodus to each other to rally themselves, which is what the Israelites should have been doing. So verse 1, when the Philistines captured the ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Now, Ebenezer's where the Israelites had camped out. That's chapter 4, verse 1.
Is that a silent D?
Ashdod?
Is there a different translation? Because it's Ashdod in the ESV here.
Did I write it wrong down? Ashdod, you are right. Dear Lord.
And I'm the one with dyslexia. So
occasionally, my brain runs faster than my hands writing these things down. So, but Ashdod.
Well, I just figure for everyone reading along.
Yeah. Excuse me. So Ebenezer was where the Israelites had started out, and Ashdod was a port city. And so it's close to the sea.
Which makes sense with the Philistines being there.
Exactly, because they're the sea people. It's a major trade center, and the first mention of it that we have in the Bible is Joshua 11:22. It's one of those cities where the Anakim had survived, so major significance there. It's one of the 5 Philistine cities. These are the main areas where the Philistines live. We've got some great archaeological work on their time there. That would be Iron Age 1 or 2. I think it actually overlaps both. So this is where they're at. And we find out in verse 2 that they take the ark of the Lord, or the ark of God at this point, they're calling it Elohim, brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. So if you remember, Dagon, the first time we encountered him was with Samson. So we talk about a lot about his history, who he might have been. If you want to go more into that, go back and listen to that episode. I'm not going to repeat it. He's one of the primary gods of the Philistines. And Samson dies in the Dagon temple. And so this is probably sometime after Samson. And now this is a different city. Samson died in the temple of Dagon in Gaza. And so now we're at a different city. So Gaza may not have had their temple rebuilt by this point. We don't know.
Yeah.
But that is something to take into consideration.
So it's real quick. I just want to. Well, okay, go ahead. Actually, with the narrative. Sorry, I think what I have to say might fit better later.
Okay. So the Philistines had acknowledged that the Hebrews had been slaves. And one of their fears is that they did not want to become slaves. So maybe what Samson did in Gaza had some impact, for actually freeing some of the Hebrews from slavery from the Philistines.
Okay.
So we see some progress there. Dagon, just one little point, was assumed to be a fish god because the Philistines were sea people. They were near the waters, and it's very close. Dagon is very close to the Hebrew word for fish.
Right.
But we know that it's probably a Canaanite grain god that they had adopted.
Right.
So
yeah, we covered a lot of that in the Samson, or not Samson.
Yeah,
Samson episodes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Forgot who I was with for a minute.
So, like I said, that's all I want to say about his history. But we do know that later Saul's head and his armor are going to be on display at the Temple of Dagon. We find that in 1 Chronicles 10:10.
Okay.
And so taking trophies is very much a part of the Philistine way of doing things. I mean, obviously they took Samson as a trophy. They put him in their temple. Now they're putting the Ark of God in the temple. And then they're going to put Saul's head and his armor in their temple. So they're being very Philistine in this act. We should expect this from them, basically.
Right.
Now, despite this, some of the rabbis, what they will do is say, "Oh, well, the Philistines actually put the Ark of the God of our God in the Temple of Dagon as a way to honor our God. That they're putting him in a place of honor."
Well, I mean, okay, the only way I can see that is if they're kind of doing like the Roman thing of like, we're just going to adopt these gods and pay homage. So, I mean, I can see possibly that, but at the same time, I go on with what you're saying because I assume you're going.
No, I mean, and that's, you brought up a good point there, because when the rabbis were writing this, I mean, this was right after Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans. So they're very much under the Roman influence in their way of thinking, or the way they think other foreign nations think about gods. So that would really explain why, from their point of view, that would make total sense. Because I'm going, how do you get there from here? I mean, I didn't see it, but when you put that little piece into play, and this is why history, and not just the history of the Bible, but what's going on in the world around them, makes sense. So others argue that the ark was put here so that Yahweh could pay proper homage to Dagon as the vanquished god, because remember, wars are not fought by men. No, they're fought by men, but they're really fought between gods.
Yeah, well, and that's kind of what I assumed, is that they were putting the ark there to be like, hey, you were defeated. Now here's the new boss.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
Well, yeah, kind of like bringing in a conquered slave. And so the point here with all of this is that the Philistines have taken the ark. So taking the gods of opposing nations, that was just kind of standard practice at this point in time. And it was not the Roman view. It was not that, hey, we're going to include you in our pantheon. We're just going to welcome you in as part of the family now. It was, they were going to put this vanquished god on display. And we know this because we have Assyrian and Hittite documents that reflect this viewpoint. And, taking these gods for them really was a sign that we did win. But verse 3, we have an unexpected turn of events. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in place. So he's fallen on the ground, face down. This is the proper posture for worshiping at this point in time. Face down, full spread out, sprawled, not on your knees. There's no dignity left in worship here. You flat on your belly. And the Philistines now have to take their god, and they have to put him back up, just as they had taken our God and put him in the temple. Now they're taking their God and putting him back where he belongs. And the writer's very specific, because he uses the terms Dagon and Yahweh. He's not using Dagon and Elohim.
Right.
He wants you to know which two gods are in this conflict. And you have to confront which god do you think is the god that should win.
Right.
So verse 4. When they rose early in the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left.
Now, okay, so
Okay.
I had always heard this taught that it fell over and the hands and head broke off. But it specifically says they were cut off and placed in the threshold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just, it fell over and they came off.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and the word there, it is very specific. So, okay, let's work through it in order so I don't lose my train of thought. But they find Dagon worshiping God once again.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, the hands and the feet are the hands of the head are cut off. They're not broken off. That is specific. And this is not an accident. This is a deliberate result of the fall, like you were saying. So taking the hands and the head of a defeated enemy, that's standard wartime practice.
Mm-hmm.
Anath decorated her body with the heads and the hands of her enemies. So we talked about her in a previous episode. The Philistines take Saul's head. David, of course, he takes Goliath's head. No head means you have no authority. No hands mean you have no power.
Mm-hmm.
So with only the trunk left, Brueggemann says this, that Dagon had been emptied of dignity proper for a god. This is complete humiliation of Dagon by Yahweh. And then, of course, verse 5, this is why the priest of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod. So, to this day. So it's believed, in Ashdod to this day, because I left it out in all of my notes. It's believed that this practice was observed well into the time of Christ. So, this had a lasting impact because the worship of Dagon did go past the time of Christ. It survived for a very long time. And doorways in almost every religion, they're significant because they mark the dividing line between the sacred and the profane. And a lot of religions will have certain rituals that you have to observe when you go into doorways, whether it's a bow. In Judaism, you got the mezuzah that you touch on your way in. It's got a copy of the laws in there. And now, instead of celebrating and entering this place of worship with remembering Dagon and what you have to do to honor Dagon, you're having to remember Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And as you enter this house of worship for another god, I mean, it's an amazing thing that's going on here because God is impacting their theology, whether they want him to or not. And, even though he's not the God being worshipped, he's still a part of their theology. Mm-hmm. So if you remember in the previous chapter, when we met Eli in the first chapter, he's sitting at the door of the temple of God, of Yahweh.
Right. He
died when he fell. He broke his neck. This is a metaphorical decapitation.
Right.
And specifically, he fell from his chair. Now, when the Dagon fell, he fell from his pedestal. Mm-hmm. And it's very much that same idea, that position of honor. What lets me know that you're important? It's where you're set.
Right.
Or where you're sitting. And the Masoretic text uses the word to let you know that this is a significant pedestal in there. So they had to put Dagon back. Mm-hmm. So if
more than one person had to pick him up.
Exactly. So he is heavy. Mm-hmm. So there is this element when you put the stories together that's kind of chilling because God is really demonstrating it doesn't matter who you are. You disrespect me, there's going to be consequences. Mm-hmm. If you're not obedient, there's going to be consequences. And it doesn't matter whether you're a chosen nation, you're one of my priests, you're a foreign god. There are certain behaviors I will not tolerate. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things is you don't take God. You don't take God anywhere. God tells you where you're going to go.
Right.
And so the fact that the Israelites had taken God and the fact that the Philistines had taken God and they, done it by taking the ark, they had to face the consequences. Mm-hmm. And, this is showing us the Philistines and the Israelites at this point, they're no better. The Israelites lost their priest.
Mm-hmm.
They're representative of the relationship they have with God, the man who facilitated that through sacrifice. And then the Philistines, they lose their idol. This is their conduit to their God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, they're very much equal players for each nation. And the fact that God allows the same thing to happen to his priest as what he does to Dagon really drives home that point.
Right.
Don't get comfortable in your position of authority. It doesn't matter. So I thought that was...
No, that is very interesting. I hadn't put that parallel together.
I hadn't either.
Yeah. Well, I mean, most of the stuff, we're not just guessing with a lot of the stuff. A lot of the stuff you're pulling out of commentaries and things like that. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's the thing. When you start, again, read the stories, get familiar with the stories, and it's just through repetition that you start picking up on different things.
Mm-hmm.
You'll start seeing these, and when you read commentators who are good and pull these similarities out, you really do learn a lot. So, verse 6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory.
Okay. Well, actually, it's kind of funny because, this is actually part of how we got to where we decided we wanted to do a podcast. Because we were talking about the humor in the Bible and how we thought some of it would be fun. And I actually originally suggested us tag teaming like a short book series of just funny things in the Bible. And then Emily's like, why don't we do a podcast? And I'm like, well, I guess. And it's turned out to be a lot of fun, but this story. Okay, so the translation that Emily read reads tumors.
Mm-hmm.
And one day I was reading it, and I don't know why my Bible app switched to KJV, and I was reading through it, and in the KJV it says hemorrhoids. And if that sounds like a familiar English word, the JPS actually has hemorrhoids in it. And so I'm like, that's kind of funny, actually. This is now, and it may, and now from what I understand, the word can be translated as like tumors, like sores more visible on the skin. But I do find it funny that specifically in the JPS and in the KJV, it was hemorrhoids.
Well, and it's one of those things. There's a lot of debate, and we're going to talk about what that debate is. But whatever it was, there is something very shameful about this disease. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, I have a cold or I have boils. I mean, there is something that causes deep humiliation with this disease.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and here's something too. Okay. And I'm going to throw out my connection here because we can I think this is a good place to throw it out. So, we talked about the crucifixion idea, that there's that feeling of abandonment, that their hope is lost when the ark goes away, right?
Right.
So there's a few things here, and I actually realized another thing when you're talking about the Samson tie-in. So this is something that just occurred to me, is that, God said to Samuel, I'm doing a new thing here. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you had a judge go in and destroy one temple of Dagon, and now Yahweh's going in and destroying the idol himself.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a pretty powerful move there. So that just occurred to me as another connection, another parallel to what's going on with Samson and how God's doing things differently. Now, I looked this up, and so when you look at what goes on here, what's he doing? It's the false god, judgment on the false god, right?
Right.
And judgment on who?
On Dagon.
Dagon. Well, and then he strikes the Philistines with boils. So it's judgment and humiliation on who? The Philistines. Who's associated with the Philistines? But the
Anakim and the Rephaim.
Yes. So you have Jesus, the crucifixion. Everyone thinks that hope's lost.
Right.
What's he actually doing? Because remember I was telling you about the NT Wright video where he talks about they paraded Jesus through as though he were a defeated prisoner, but he was actually leading them to their own destruction and humiliation. And so, and then you have Paul saying in Colossians, what is it, 2 verse 15, and he disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to shame, triumphing over them. And how did he do it? In what seemed like a defeat. And how does God do this? He does it in what seems like a defeat. And so I'm just like, the connection there is just mind-blowing.
The gospel's always been available. I mean, in some form or fashion, the gospel has always been available, and it's been played out in ways that people can understand and see.
Yeah.
Because I can't imagine that if any of these Philistines had seen this and went, you know what? He destroyed Dagon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to follow this God.
Yeah.
What would have been God's response to that? I mean, we've already seen what it would be with Ruth and with Rahab and with Caleb.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
so in Othniel. So we know that when anybody turned away from their God and accepted the God of Israel, God accepted them.
Yeah. And so, and at the cross, Jesus exercises judgment on the rulers, the false gods, and the demonic influences, which would have been the disembodied Rephaim. It makes sense if you tie that all together.
Yeah, I hadn't taken it that far because I see exactly where you're going with that and what you're saying with that, because it is true. And one of the things I think we forget is that this is not, Jesus didn't just show up and, break off and do something that's completely unrelated to anything that's gone before.
Right.
He's always been a part of this history. And I think that we need to be seeing that when we read through the Old Testament and looking for him and not as in types, other people who are showing up and being foreshadowing, but actually looking for him.
There's some of that.
There is.
And I think this story is a great example of it,
mm-hmm.
Of seeing how this all plays out.
But when I see it here, I think the difference, I'm not seeing David as a type of God or a type of Jesus in the New Testament. I'm seeing God be God,
mm-hmm.
both here in the Old Testament and in the New Testament in Jesus. And those are the ones that I really like, because I don't have to worry about going too far with the analogy. I don't have to, God is God, and I can celebrate that. So, but yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I'm going to bring in where I tied in some of that when I get to the point where, yeah. So
I thought that was kind of a good middle point where we've seen some of the humiliation
mm-hmm.
and judgment start in here, but going forward, we can kind of overlay this idea and put it all together.
Well, because I bring it in a different way, but it just shows you how the Bible, it is multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the reason why you need to study in groups and you need to study with people who are equally committed to learning, because what one person sees isn't going to be what another person sees.
Right.
Or, maybe they see the same thing, but they see it from two different angles and you get that different perspective. And every time you learn a new perspective, as long as you're still, going back to the Bible, you're still looking towards God, you're making your knowledge that much better. You're getting a depth there that you don't get otherwise. So, going to get back to the text, and we know the hand of the Lord was heavy against the Philistines. Now, first time we hear this phrase is the hand of the Lord is Exodus 9:3, and it's when God sends the plagues against the livestock in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the hand language, it's very common in the Akkadian, and their phrase for being afflicted literally was the hand was heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, whenever affliction was lifted, it was he will lift his hand. So there's this idea that whenever you're oppressed, a god in the Akkadian, or in our case, the God, will lay his hand on you, and it's heavy. It's kavod, and we're back to that connection there. And there's also Assyrian references to it. But affliction, when we start talking about that, now we're back with Hannah's prayer. When we're remembering that, we're remembering the
mm-hmm.
burning bush, and it was reminding us all of this is supposed to be viewed through the lens of Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
So the writer's being really good at pulling these things back to our remembrance. And so I realized, hold on one second.
You skip a note there?
I think I did. Oh, I did, and it's important
Okay.
because it's just one line, but I realized I missed it. God's hand is heavy against the Philistines, but Dagon has no hands. So the writer's really just kind of twisting that knife.
Mhm.
That this is the problem that's going on here. So one of the things that the Philistines do know is that Egypt had been afflicted with plagues,
Mhm.
specifically with tumors. As you said in the KJV, it's hemorrhoids. After it's often translated as hemorrhoids. It literally means little mountains or hills,
Mhm.
and it has been used for tumors in other situations.
Right.
So Samuel Driver, and this is the guy who wrote the BDB, the Brown Driver Briggs.
Okay. Yeah.
This is
So, no slouch.
yeah. That's the lexicon every person who studies Hebrew is going to be told they need to buy.
Mhm.
He says that this is a euphemism because the disease is so terrible that its real name should not be spoken. So, yeah.
Huh.
Now, another alternative view of that is not necessarily that the disease is so terrible it shouldn't be spoken, but the body part it afflicts should not be spoken in proper company.
Okay.
So, possible diseases, there's three, basically. Anal tumors or hemorrhoids.
Don't say that again.
You don't want that on a prayer list? I mean, yeah. This is... So,
Sorry, carry on.
Dysentery, which this was not an uncommon ailment at that point in time.
Right.
The bubonic plague.
Okay.
So the bubonic plague actually makes some sense because this is a port city, as I mentioned before.
Mhm.
And when you have port cities, you always have this one little critter that shows up, rats.
Right. Well, and it doesn't say it specifically here,
Mm-hmm.
but it does say that they were afflicted with mice
Yes.
later on.
Yes. And that's the other thing that ties it in. Now, there's the theory is, and again, we're having to speculate, so I'm offering some speculation just to kind of let people play with this. The theory is that the writer doesn't bring up the rats or the mice until later because he doesn't want there to be any mistake in your mind that this is an act of God.
Mhm.
So we can't blame it on observable natural causes. We have to attribute it to God. And so by waiting until we get to that point where the mice are offered up, then we are still looking at God. And then the mice kind of come in and go, oh, well, that might have been the mechanism.
Right.
So that's one idea. But you're going to love this. So the rabbis were not content to leave this alone.
Of course not.
I
I mean, who would be?
They
It started a podcast.
right. No, they said, this is in the Talmud, guys. Don't beat me. So they said that when the Philistines were relieving themselves, that the mice would crawl into their bodies and eat their intestines and pull out their bowels.
Well,
Yeah. And that's why they say the mice came into the picture, that it wasn't just the disease, that the mice were literally attacking these guys from the inside out. So, yeah.
you just gotta wonder.
I mean,
So,
it's like, this is not some fun experience. Let's say that. We have enough illustrations to show that this is something that's causing a great deal of...
a lot of distress.
there we go. There we go.
We'll use that one.
Distressed is good. So, now, the rabbis also say that the Philistines deserved this kind of over-the-top, horrific punishment because they had mocked God before the battle, and that they had said that God had used up his plagues in Egypt. And so he didn't have anything else to come at them with. And this is the reason why they were so brave. It was that they didn't see the
Ark is a threat.
yeah, it's like, okay, he's done all he can do. He's got no more power left. And so we can go attack because we know that he's depleted all of his energy in Egypt.
Okay.
So the thing is, this is a disease of Egypt. This specifically is something that happened. Deuteronomy 28:27 says the Lord will strike you with the boils of Egypt and with the tumors, and that's that emerald, the tumors and scabs and itch of which you cannot be healed. So one of the promises that the children of Israel are given is if you obey me, if you honor me, if you worship me and don't worship other gods, you won't get this.
Right.
But if you do, now you're fair game. And the Philistines, by taking the Ark of God, and this is the center of worship for Israel, now they're subject to the same rules as Israel.
Right.
Now, I think there's something there. I think there's a lesson in that. Don't take the things of Christianity if you aren't going to be a Christian. Because, if you say you're a Christian...
Maybe don't take God's name in vain.
Precisely. And because I think that's really kind of what's happening here on one level. And I don't think we often realize that the idea of putting another God in their temple, the natural progress would have been somebody would have started praying to the ark. Somebody would have said, hey, well, it's here and it's with Dagon. And so I'm going to offer my prayers to Dagon and, put my food offering or whatever before him. And I'm going to leave a cookie over here to this lonely God.
Right.
And something good is going to happen that day. So, hey, I'm going to go back tomorrow and give him 3 cookies, and it's going to be that kind of progression. That's what happened. And so there is this element the Philistines were trying to humiliate God. I don't doubt that. But at the same time, just given human nature and the way that we begin to incorporate in other methods and ways of worship, every chance we're given.
Right.
The people would have started moving that direction, and then they would have said, hey, we're worshipers of Yahweh. And if you're a worshiper of Yahweh, you need to adhere to the standard God has set before them, which was Deuteronomy, which is if you're worshiping other gods, you're going to get this disease. So now the Philistines, by taking the ark, have made themselves liable for this disease.
Yep.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes sense.
Anyhow, yeah. I mean, well, and some of the stuff, if you just stop and look at how people operate and stop just reading the words on the pages, but actually look at how the people, what were they doing behind the words? So anyway, verse 7, when the men of Ashdod saw how many things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon, our God. So they recognize what's going on here. And it's interesting that this is a reversal from Pharaoh. They didn't harden their hearts. They said, we got to get him out of here.
Actually, I found that really interesting. They're like, let's not make the same mistake the Egyptians did.
That's exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, they understand if we continue on this path, we're going to be just like the Egyptians, and it takes one plague, to get their attention. They don't need 10. So,
well, I mean, and that just kind of goes to prove that what God did, it paved the way for this to happen. And
right. And so he doesn't have to be as drastic. And yeah, so when people, they talk about, all the cruelty in the Bible, everything that we're through the Bible, what we see is this progressively getting less and less cruel. We see what we perceive in our modern minds as being horrible and mean. We're moving away from that. But when you look at the Bible, the things that bring on these kinds of judgments, these quote unquote acts of cruelty, they're caused by human choice and they're caused by human action. And then you bring in the divine counsel worldview and then we bring in that side of things. But so often it's because people have chosen. The Philistines attacked the Israelites and they had been trying to take over their land. They'd made them slaves. Of course, God's going to push back with them. God was so rough on Egypt because they had enslaved his people. Of course, he's going to attack them. And it only got as bad as it did because Pharaoh had decided that he was not going to obey God. And yes, God hardened his heart, but that was after Pharaoh had already made his intentions known. And God said, we're going to roll with that. If that's the way you want to do it, that's how we'll do it. And so often we find in the scripture, when somebody says, this is how we're going to do it, God says, okay, have it your way.
Right.
And so we're going to talk about that with Saul. But notice that this is the third morning that they have come in and found that Dagon, with the Dagon thing, the third morning that they're going to release him from the house of Sheol. The house of Dagon.
Yeah.
Yeah. God can't be contained in the house of Dagon. And I think it's very interesting that it's the third morning, because when you get the third morning, now we're thinking about the crucifixion, we're thinking about the resurrection. Jesus cannot be contained in the home of death.
Mhm.
And so I love that, because this is, God's reemergence into the world. And it's not just, oh, well, we're just going to put him out with the garbage. No, there's a very specific way in which he's going to return to his country.
Mhm.
And so, and when it's not done right, there's problems there. But anyway, verse 8. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of the covenant, with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. Now, the lords, this is the elders, this is the leading class. So we're reminded what happened at Shiloh. They talked to the elders.
Mhm.
What should we do? Well, we're going to take the ark. Okay, so now in both cities, we've got this going on, that you don't go to the elders when you've got a prophet in the land. And you kind of have to wonder, I mean, as enmeshed as the Philistines and the Israelites are at this point in time, did they know about Samuel?
Right.
Could they have gone, hey, we need some help here? I mean, this is a possibility, because we're going to find out that there's several Israelites still living among the Philistines at this point in time.
Mhm.
So they make the decision to move the ark to Gath. And now Gath is most famous for being the home of Goliath.
Yeah.
And it might be that they're moving Gath away from the ocean, away from the sea, thinking maybe if we get him away from the port city where there's all these mice and rats, which cause the plagues, then we can see that this really isn't the God of Israel doing this.
Mhm.
It just happened at the same time. So Gath, when the ark shows up, I mean, they just break into panic. I mean, tumors break out, and they decide we're done, and they send the ark to Ekron.
Mhm.
So R.P. Gordon describes this as the reverse victory tour. So where you were talking about the victory tour earlier, and parading,
Mhm.
yeah. Now
That's
this
funny.
is, yeah, it's the idea that as God moves through their city, he, instead of being, the conquered God, that the other gods get to be praised for their victory, or Dagon specifically. This is God, that's the conquered God coming in and just systematically destroying all the gods who are there. Now, I'm not saying this is the same manifestation of knocking over the
The
idol.
temple, but
Yeah,
he's spreading disease.
he is.
And the people's gods are not able to protect them from Yahweh.
Well, and it makes you wonder, were they brave enough to put him in the nether temple of Dagon and the other cities, or they're like, no, we're gonna, put him over here in the cowshed? I mean, what's going on here? We don't really know. So the people of Ekron, they send for the lords of the Philistines, and they want the ark sent away, and they specifically want it returned to its place.
Mhm.
And that word there is makom. And if you remember,
The place.
the place, yes, the place God shows you, the place that God says, I will be manifest here and nowhere else. We talked a lot about that with the Abraham and Isaac. So if you want to go
Mhm.
back to that, again, the hand of God was heavy, and Dagon still doesn't have any hands. And the idea that of the makom is, I should point out, is very central to Judaism. And we need to remember over and over again in Scripture, God is very specific about, this is where I'm going to be.
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm not going to show up where you want me to be. I'm going to be where I want to be. You don't get to move me. Again, I think that's another really good teaching point, because so often today I see people, well, I like this, and this about Christianity, and so I'm going to worship God my own way.
Mhm.
And even though it's not a physical move, in some ways, it's
Oh, yeah.
kind of like moving God. You don't do that.
Right.
And
No, that makes sense.
so, but the good news is that the Philistine theology, it's improving.
It's getting better all the time. But is it, though?
Well, at least they're able to say God needs to be where he wants to be. The Israelites, it's going to take them a longer time to figure this out. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, it's not really going to be until David and David's going to learn the hard way
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
God is going to be where he wants to be, and you don't get to move him. And so, but verse 12, the men who did not die were struck by tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. Now, again, we got the reversal. The Philistines are crying out like the slaves of Egypt.
Mhm.
They're the ones who are being afflicted. They aren't crying out like, and the cries go up to heaven. So originally, the Israelites were acting like the Philistines when we started the story. And by the end of it, the Philistines are acting like the Israelites.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's fascinating that you have this whole change up, and the change up comes because God showed up.
Yeah.
They still don't get it right completely, but they are they're getting closer. And I just feel like my notes were a little short there. So okay, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into chapter 6 because it's still the same story.
Yeah.
So we know that the ark was there for 7 months. We find that in verse 1 of chapter 6. And 7 is a symbolic number. We all know this.
Mhm.
It's completeness, it's perfection, it's consummation. And so you have to ask yourself, what's complete?
Right.
Was it God's time in exile was complete, or the Philistines' time of suffering was complete? Either way, God decides it's time for a change. And the problem with sending an ark back or any god back is basically you're saying, oh yeah, we thought we had defeated the god, but we really can't control him, so we got to send him home.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the ransom of Red Chief.
Right.
And
right.
so
I was trying to think of that name. Yeah, the name of that. They took someone captive, and they were in so much trouble. They were trying to get them to take him back.
Yeah, the parents were like, no, we aren't paying, and the kidnappers are like, no, we'll pay you. just take your kid back. So anyway, but this is connected to Genesis 21 verses 22 through 24.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the story is Abraham shown up at Abimelech's house. Abimelech is the king of the Philistines, and he shows up at Abimelech's house, and Abimelech sees Sarah, his
Mm-hmm.
wife, who's
Mm-hmm.
so beautiful. And of course, what does Sarah tell him? And what does Abraham tell him? I'm your sister. And so there's a problem. I'm sorry. Well, this has happened before the Genesis account I'm going into, but Abraham and Abimelech kind of form their bond
Right.
with that story.
Mm-hmm.
But the passage in Genesis 21 through 22 through 34, Abraham and Abimelech have this dispute over a well. And the well's at Beersheba, which this is actually where Samuel's sons were, sorry. And Abraham, instead of, fighting with Abimelech and trying to make some kind of stand and saying, look, you're doing wrong by me, he sends Abimelech 7 sheep.
Okay.
And this is a covenant ceremony. He made a covenant with Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. And Abimelech at that point says, I'll go back to the land of the Philistines. It's all cool. We're okay now. Now, Abraham stays at Beersheba, and he thinks he's going to live there for a while. He plants a tree.
Mhm.
And so you don't plant a tree if you're getting ready to walk up and leave. I mean,
Right.
we've had whole conversations about that lately.
Yeah.
But the thing is, was Abraham right to make this covenant? That's the question. Now, remember, this is before the Exodus. This is before we get the Torah, when we get the commands not to make a covenant with the people in Canaan. So Abraham doesn't have that. But the tradition is, and again, this is tradition, not Bible, make that very clear,
Mm-hmm.
was because he sent Abimelech 7 sheep, the ark would be exiled in the land of the Philistines for 7 months. And what this does, is it true? Probably not. I mean, this is not kind of the
Yeah, this is just some random tradition trying to fill in
right.
gaps.
Yeah, this is, it's a Jewish folklore, and it allows people to make sense of the ark being taken, because it's so unthinkable that the ark would be taken by the Philistines when we know how bad the Philistines are, and that they're doing it for 2 reasons, not just to make sense of how it's taken, but also to show that God really has been in control of this since the beginning of time. There's no timestamp on God's ability to control things. And I think from that point of view, it's kind of like, okay, that's fine. You got your tradition.
Mhm.
But at the same time, we don't want to add too much to the story. But these are the ways that sometimes we try to understand things we can't.
Right.
And so we need to be careful, but sometimes it's also just kind of fun to look at these things and go, oh, okay, this is what people were thinking. So, verse 2, the Philistines called for the priest and the diviners, and they said, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us, what shall we send it to its place? So, weird wording there with the ESV. But priests and diviners, we're moving back from the lords.
Right.
We're moving to the spiritual leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And we're asking them, what should we do? Now, contrast that with Israel, who didn't talk to Samuel.
Right.
Like I said, the Philistines, their theology is getting better throughout all of this. So, but this also connects us back to Exodus 7:11 with Pharaoh's magicians. Remember, they're not counterfeits. And I think so often we dismiss spiritual, what does it say? Priests and diviners. Mm-hmm. We dismiss them as counterfeit powers or leaders. Mm-hmm. The Bible never says they're counterfeits. Matter of fact, it talks about how effective they can be. I mean, Pharaoh's magicians, they can do everything Moses and Aaron could do, mm-hmm. and up to the third plague, and that was the gnats.
Right.
Once we get to the gnats, they can't do anything. By the time we get to the boils, which could have some connection with this, they can't even stand before Moses and Aaron. And so this means that when I say everything, I mean, they're turning staffs into serpents, water to blood. They're making frogs emerge from the Nile. So they have some ability. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we just want to act like they don't have any ability. And that's not true.
Right. Well, it helps us feel at ease, helps us feel like that, because we want to talk about, there's this idea that Satan has no power, or the adversary mm-hmm. has no power. Mm-hmm. And I think that is kind of a hyperbolic statement. There's not that there's no power. It's just against God. There is, in his authority, there's nothing that can stand against that.
Yeah. Well, it's like, yeah. And we can do that with a human-God relationship too. We have power as human beings up against God's. It is nothing. It's that comparison model. Mm-hmm. So yes. And the thing is, if you're a human being and you're talking about a spiritual entity, then they have the ability to do things that we're not capable of, and that seems like power. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to be aware of when we start talking spiritual warfare. Yes, there is power in the dark and the foreign gods and the pagan gods, and don't take it lightly. Are we supposed to be afraid of it? Absolutely not.
Right.
But don't be just dismissive because you don't want to go there. But the term diviner actually takes us back to Balaam. Mm-hmm. And we got to remember his blessings and curses. He refused to curse Israel. He winds up blessing Israel. And this is Numbers 22, I think. I didn't write it down. But they're true. They happen. They are one of the oldest parts of the Bible. And his prophecies are correct. Mm-hmm. And so he's not in service to God. Matter of fact, there's some really harsh things said about him in Revelations. And he is put to death for the things that he does. Mm-hmm. So again, don't be dismissive. But anyway, basically, what shall we send it to its place? That last line of that verse basically is, how do we get rid of this thing?
Right.
We don't want it here. So the priest and the diviners, they said, if you send away the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it away empty, but by all means return it to him with a guilt offering. Then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand does not turn away from you. So a guilt offering, mm-hmm. same words we find in Leviticus 5, mm-hmm. Specifically verse 14. If anyone commits a breach of faith and has sins unintentionally in any of the holy things of the Lord, you offer up a guilt offering.
Right.
So how intentional, unintentional was this? I mean, in some ways it is unintentional because they don't understand
what they're dealing with.
Yeah.
Who they're dealing with.
And in other ways, it's very intentional because Dagon is their god. And as their god, he is the one who needs to be honored, and he's the one who's going to win. And then now they're being shown that everything they'd assumed about Dagon really wasn't true.
Right.
Now, imagine us being in that position. I mean, can you imagine finding out that everything you've thought about the Bible being and who God is as a person isn't true?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But
yeah, you thing you've had your faith in is uprooted, supplanted, all that business.
Well, and in that point in time, I mean, faith really was the center of your world. It wasn't something you just did on Sunday morning. And so this isn't just an ideology that's being overthrown. This is your whole way of life that's being overthrown. So we do have these connections to Exodus. And one of the connections is that the Israelites leave with the Egyptians' gold. That's Exodus 11, 2, and 3. And it also connects us right back to Abraham and Sarah with Abimelech, because Abimelech says, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver so that it to be a covering for his eyes. And so the people ask, what should they send? And the diviners come up with this answer: 5 golden tumors. All I can think of is the chocolate face is going around. It's like, who wants that? Who wants a mold of 5 golden anal tumors?
Right.
This is not. If I can find a parallel in today's society that upsets me and makes me feel icky, can you imagine how much a holy God feels icky at the idea? He's like, no, this is insulting.
So there's and it's like, do they make 5 of the same one? Do everyone have to get their own? I mean, because it says it's to represent the 5 rulers.
So every lord of the Philistines is having a mold cast.
And so I don't want to spend any more time on this really than we have to, but that's
how ridiculous it is, though.
One of the questions I have. And then 5 golden mice. So they're showing that they all have the same plague. All 5 cities are dealing with the same things because they're sending the same golden objects. Right.
And so these are not payments. What you have to remember is when you create a likeness of something and you send it away, you're basically you're using sympathetic magic. And we talked about that with Jacob. So this isn't just an offering. We're putting all of the evil, or trying to put all of the evil that's been inflicted on us into this gold, and we're going to send it back to God. This is very reminiscent of the Azazel ceremony
I actually thought of that earlier. Yeah, the scapegoat thing.
We're going to put all of the sins of the nation in the wilderness, and we're going to send it back out to all the sins of the nation on the goat, and send the goat into the wilderness because that's where sin lives. And so these plagues were sent by God, so we're going to send them back to God.
Right.
And so this is our first mention of the mice. We hadn't heard of them before. We talked about why that is. And we learned that not only are the mice, a problem, as the rabbis said they might have been, this is, they've been ravaging the land. And
and I actually, and I think it's appropriate because what do mice do? They eat your grain. And if Dagon's a grain god, then
yes,
that's going to be a problem.
And what do we find in Egypt? So often those plagues are just against the representation of so many gods in there. So I think that's a really good point. I didn't bring that out. So we also in verse 5, they want to give glory. They want to give kavod to the God of Israel. And perhaps he will lighten his hand from off of you and your gods and your lands. So kavod, they want to give heaviness so that maybe God will lighten. So you have that contrast there.
Yeah.
And it's very deliberately that play on words. And here's the thing: the Israelites had not given glory to God. They had tried to use God. So God's in the land of the Philistines, and they're trying to give glory to God there. And this is messed up. It's not something that should be happening. And it's flipping theology on its head over and over again. I mean, you can just see this like a load in the dryer just tumbling around. So because a God in exile is a powerless God, and Yahweh has showed himself to be powerful in the land of the Philistines. This is not what anybody expected. This is why the Israelites are back home crying their eyes out, having babies dying, saying, Ichabod, the glory has been in an exile.
Mhm.
This is the problem, because we forget that the Ark of the Covenant, again, not just a pretty box. This is the symbol of their freedom. This is a symbol of their unity as a nation. This is a symbol of how God is going to manifest himself among the people. And so to lose that, to lose the one thing that has united you for generations now,
Mhm.
this, I mean, think about how we as a nation felt when the Twin Towers were gone.
Mhm.
I mean, it wasn't, and a lot of us didn't have any real connection to the Twin Towers until after the event.
Right.
And so this is more than that to them.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's, just one way for us to attempt to try to contextualize it so that we can understand what they might have been going through. So we can get some more on this. And, I've still got several pages on this chapter.
Yeah.
And we'll be able to dive into it a little deeper, because once we get through it, there's actually some things I want to go back and pick out that you just didn't want to disrupt the narrative with.
Okay.
So
But yeah, that seems like a decent place to pause with the getting ready to send the arc back. And the story ends in a very unexpected way.
right.
That I read through it again, and I was like, and I had actually forgotten how it ended, and I was actually surprised. I was like, I don't remember that, and that's going to be something we're going to have to. I really want to find out what's up with that, because that is crazy.
I think I have an answer for why it ends the way it does.
Okay.
I really do. So
all right. Well, we'll be looking for that probably on the next episode, maybe.
Maybe. We'll see.
Depends on how much we get through. So, well, cool. We're going to pause there. And if you want to be part of the conversation, if you have questions and concerns about the story, feel free to hit us up on ravencreeksc.com or facebook.com/ravencreeksc, or on all the social media, really. If you really like what you heard, want to help keep us going, pay hosting fees and all that business, patreon.com/ravencreeksc is a great way to get yourself a mug,
T-shirt,
or a t-shirt, or you can just hit up the Raven Creek shop if you'd rather just purchase one. Anyway, other than that, that's all the self-promotion I'm going to do there. Other than that, share this with a friend, I guess. Well, I guess I'm not done with the promotion, but share this with a friend if you like it, or don't, or just share it. But anyway,
sharing's good.
We'll be back next week. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes, or consider supporting us on patreon.com/ravencreeksc. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.